Truth Barista is a production of High Beam Ministry and uses the imaginary Ersatz coffee shop as its platform to bring you a conversation about a plethora of scintillating topics. We don't shy away from any issue that is plaguing our culture or the church today, whether it's current cultural issues, questions about Bible verses, or even just some banter to encourage you. Dr. Jay Christensen is the Truth Barista, and he and amazing Larry Kutzler brew up highly caffeinated conversations for our day. Grab a cup of joe, plop yourself down in the booth next to us, and get ready to think. The Truth Barista is a production of High Beam Ministry, and it's listener supported. For more information about the Truth Barista, go to highbeamministry.com. Thanks for listening.
There was a guy named Jacob who had a pretty bumpy past. He played some tricks on his brother Esau and took away his special brotherly stuff, causing a big fight between them. Now, as Jacob was on his journey, he reached a spot called Peniel and thought it was a good place to sleep for the night. But guess what happened? In the middle of the night, out of nowhere, a mysterious dude showed up and started wrestling with Jacob. They tussled and turned, rolling around until the sun was about to rise. Jacob figured out that this wasn't just any ordinary wrestling match. He was tangling with someone super special, maybe even a bit divine. Here's the cool part. Jacob wasn't ready to give up. He told the mysterious man, "I'm not letting go until you give me a blessing." Talk about determination. It's like saying, "I won't stop until I get something awesome from you." And you know what? Jacob's persistence paid off, and he got his blessing. This tale teaches us all about hanging in there, even when things get tough, and not giving up on what's important to us.
This is the Truth Barista, where we serve you the uncompromised truth.
Well, Dr. J, we're at it again, and I'm excited because we're going to talk about the WWF, aren't we? Wrestling.
Well, yes, we are. We're going to talk about wrestling, but we're not going to talk about the WWF of our day. We're going to go back a couple of thousand years. In fact, about 3,000 years plus to one of the biggest wrestling matches you will ever read about.
Well, I'm excited about it no matter what because I like wrestling. So where are we going?
Okay, we're going all the way back to Genesis 32, where Jacob wrestles with God. Now, to give you a little background story here, Jacob, his whole life, has been wrestling to try to get God's blessing. This is the deal. When he was still in the womb with his brother Esau, they were twins, Rebekah was told by God that the lesser, first would serve the second. Well, Esau came out first, but Jacob came out second, holding on to his heel. And so they named him Yaakov, which comes from the Hebrew word Ikev, which means heel. In other words, he was grasping the heel in the sense that it's like when you try to trip somebody up, you grab their heel or you kick their heel, they trip, you run ahead. Well, that was kind of Jacob's whole life. When Esau came to him hungry, Jacob says, I'll give you this great bowl of Campbell's soup here, but you got to give me your birthright, which means leadership of the family. And big dumb Esau went, okay, you can have it. And so Esau had the soup, lost the birthright. Well, then the blessing of the family is the inheritance that has to go with the leadership, the birthright. And so Jacob's mom, Rebekah, worked with Jacob to deceive his father Isaac and steal the blessing from Esau through deception. So then Esau gets mad, wants to murder Jacob. Jacob runs off to his uncle Laban. Well, his uncle Laban is more of a conniver and more of a trip-up artist than Jacob was, and actually starts cheating Jacob. And the only way Jacob can win is if God steps in, tells Jacob the plan, which he does, and winds up overcoming and winning this economic wrestling match with Laban. He's right on the edge of what we call modern-day Israel near the Jordan River. He hears that Esau is coming, and he knows that Esau wants to kill him. And so what's he going to do? He is about to enter into the biggest wrestling match of his life, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
Oh, I'm excited. You know, one of the things that I have always thought about Esau was that sin of betrayal, Dr. J, is one of the worst sins there is because you seem to not be able to get rid of it. And obviously it was 20 years and he still had a thing, right, against his brother?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was mad. Oh, yeah, he was mad. We think. And that's what Jacob thinks. I mean, what's he going to do with this madman Esau, who is a big man, hairy man, strong man? It's kind of like some guy walking. It's like Popeye without spinach walking into the ring with Bluto. You know, he knows he's going to get pasted. So Jacob is going, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Yeah, God steps in.
Yeah, he's a perfect WWF wrestler, that's for sure.
That's right. So here's where the story picks up, and it's actually in Genesis 32, and we're going to pick it up at verse 24, and I'll read through it quick, and then we'll talk through it and get some application here. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not defeat him, he struck Jacob's hip socket as they wrestled and dislocated his hip. Then he said to Jacob, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." "What is your name?" the man asked. "Jacob," he replied. "Your name will no longer be Jacob." He said, "It will be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he answered, "Why do you ask my name?" And he blessed him there. Jacob then named the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, which is what that word means. He says, and I have been delivered. In other words, he prevailed, or he was safe. Verse 31, the sun shone on him as he passed by Penuel, limping because of his hip. That is why to this day the Israelites don't eat the thigh muscle of an animal that is at the hip socket, because he, the wrestler, struck Jacob's hip socket at the thigh muscle. Okay, there's some really fascinating things. Jacob is by a brook that empties into the Jordan called the Yabak. And the root word of Yabak means to empty, to lay waste, and to make void. At this point, Jacob knows that Esau is coming, and he's afraid for his family and his possessions. So in a sense, he sends them out to the side, and he empties himself of all of these things. So he's standing there alone, hoping to meet Esau face to face. But instead, he meets a man in standalone condition. He meets a man and begins to wrestle with him. In other words, Jacob comes to grips with God, and he wrestles with him all night long till daybreak. Now, Jacob's got to have some physical strength and stamina to do this. But really, what is this wrestling match about? We have to understand that all his life, Jacob struggled to win against outside forces to get what he wanted. In fact, what the Lord had already promised him. So in essence, what he's doing is trying to get what God promised him, or the promises of God, but doing it in his own strength. And he wrestled with Esau, Isaac, his father, and Laban, his uncle. Now he's struggling with God himself. And by facing God, he ends up facing himself, not his call. See, I don't see it as a will he reach his God-ordained destiny, but more how. In other words, in whose strength, in whose way will he reach God's promise that God gave him at Bethel of a land, uncountable descendants filling the land and blessing the whole earth? How will that be fulfilled? Will he take it from Esau? Will he scheme it from his dad? Will he get the economics through deception with Laban? No, God has to give it to him. So now Jacob is wrestling with the one who is the source of all of these promises and the only one that can fulfill them. Up to this point, he's been struggling against man, but it was really the Lord all along in the background that he was contending with. And so before Jacob could come to grips with Esau, his dreaded enemy, he had to come to grips with God. So Jacob's wrestling and leveraging nature had to be conquered for him to fulfill God's plan. So Jacob was continually wrestling with his own nature to wrest the advantage and the future for himself, even though the Lord had said, you're going to get it anyway. Why? Because God wanted to give it to him. He didn't want Jacob to take it to himself. But how much does that reflect who we are as people? Yes, I know God can give us all sorts of things. God's promised us all sorts of things. But darn it, I'm going to work for it. I'm going to force people's hands. I'm going to force God's hands to give me what God has promised. That's the situation that Jacob is in. So what do you think about that, sir?
Well, I think it's human nature.
Exactly.
I think that we just want what we want, and it's a Romans 1 generation. That's how we roll. Human nature rolls that way anyway.
Well, and think of it back to Genesis. God says, this is what I want you to do. I've given you everything you want. You just don't get to make your own decisions regarding it. So what did they do? They made their own decisions regarding all these things. So that's the issue. So in verse 25, God gets a grip on Jacob, who has a grip on him. So there are two things here. Jacob is persistent and God is in absolute control. Though God really pushed as hard as Jacob could stand, the Lord couldn't overpower him. Now, it's like, really? Like God couldn't overpower Jacob? God can't overpower a man? Well, no, that's not the point. The point is he couldn't get Jacob to give up the goal, which was to win. Jacob wouldn't let himself lose or just walk away. So even exhausted and in pain, he still wouldn't let go of God. God came to Jacob in a form that he could literally wrestle with. But God showed Jacob that he could disable Jacob at will. And this was proof to Jacob who's really in control and how he was accomplishing things in his life. You know, there are just some things we can't do in our own strength and cleverness. Now talk about being emptied of yourself. Mm-hmm. And so what we're seeing in this part is this. God has a covenant plan for Jacob's life, but does Jacob have what it takes to fight for those promises? If Jacob fights for the covenant, in whose strength and intelligence will he do so, his or the Lord? The Lord pushed Jacob to his limit, both in power and persistence. Jacob's ability to be strong and hang on to God is what matters. And even when his strength was removed, Jacob still clung to God. This outer and inner strength is going to be crucial for Israel's descendants. Why? Think of your history and Bible history. How did the Israelites make it through Egypt and the oppression there? How did they make it through the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles and come back to the promised land so that they could thrive and Messiah could be born from them? How could the Jews last for the last 2,000 years and survive the Crusades and the pogroms and the Holocaust and still be in the land? It's the persistence of Jacob that is in their nature. They've wrestled with God, and God has preserved them. What do you think about that?
Well, I love it. You know, it just seems that the will that's at play here is strong. And we know when we come to Christ, it's the will that has to change, right? It has to submit to Jesus. And so the will is very important. So God saw the will of Jacob and saw the resiliency of the will and knew it had to change. And so that's fascinating, Dr. J.
But the will has to be directed properly.
Correct.
It's not self-will, it's a will after God's will. That's the point. So moving on to verse 26, then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go." In spite of being exhausted, disabled, and in pain, Jacob uses the only thing he has left, his arms. He hangs in there tenaciously. In other words, he's saying to the man who's wrestling him, the Lord, "I can't win in this situation in any way, Lord, but neither will I give up on you." That's the level to which the Lord is bringing Jacob. Even when everything is stripped away and it's just Jacob and God, God takes Jacob to the wall, which brings Jacob's core nature to the surface. This proves to everyone at that moment what Jacob was really made of. After years of wrestling with God and man, Jacob is finally revealed to himself and will be revealed to the world. Here is a person who, at the absolute end of his strength and wits, will continue to hang in with God for the promised birthright and blessing. This, as I pointed out, has affected all of history. In fact, there's coming a time, we've talked about this at the end, we call it the tribulation. We think it's all about us, because it's all about us. That's how the modern day worship song goes, right?
Very good, very good. I love the way you sing.
Yeah, it's always like, it's all about me. You should do things my way, right? Right. Well, that's not the point. In this point, God says, no, it's all about me. And you're going to do things my way, Jacob. And so this is the wrestling match. Now look at what happens here. Jacob replies, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And the man asked him, "What's your name?" "Jacob." Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you've struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob's big blessing is a name change. Big deal, right? It is a big deal. This is the point. Jacob's been pursuing God's blessing his whole life. Now he realizes it doesn't come from his own efforts, but from God alone. The name change is important. Biblical names often describe a person's nature or mission. So when God asked him, "What's your name?" It wasn't because God didn't have a clue. He knows Jacob's nature and he knows to what he's called Jacob. It's because he wanted Jacob to have a clue. God was saying, reveal yourself. See who you are. Jacob probably dropped his eyes, and even though it's not recorded, you could hear him think or even say, I'm the supplanter. I trip people up so I can win. To supplant means to get under the foot. Grabbing Esau's heel at birth was a picture of tripping him up so Jacob could move ahead. Laban pulled the same stunt on Jacob, and Jacob was offended, probably because Laban was better at it than he was. Now, if it weren't for God alone, Jacob would have had nothing after meeting Laban. But there's no tripping up God in this wrestling match. So when Jacob came face to face with God, God showed Jacob to Jacob. The Lord wanted him to honestly admit, yeah, Lord, this is who I am. Now, a name also denotes mastery or authority over something. You remember back in Genesis, God has Adam name the animals and all the creatures? Well, that shows that Adam was the master or the authority over nature. Now, Jacob had wonderful God-given traits. His strength and tenacity were from God, but they had to be submitted to the Lord, or these same traits would eventually trip up and destroy Jacob. So God changed something in him. It wasn't his mission. That remained the same. Abraham, Isaac, and now Jacob. Same mission today. The change was in Jacob to make him a better fit for the mission. God's covenant promises will not be had through human manipulation or human strength. God's plans for us will only go forward when we have mastered ourselves, when Jacob has mastered himself and is himself under the mastery of God, just like it was intended for Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So this is a remarkable thing that's happening in Jacob. He's coming face to face with himself for who he is. And God says, I'm going to use that, only now I'm going to change it. Mm-hmm. I'm going to show the change that you're now not going to do it through yourself. You're going to depend wholly on me. And your response, sir?
Well, I just think if we modernize it just a tad, is it his self-importance that he's getting at, the pride, the ego, all of that he's bringing to the surface to show that, Jacob, you've been the grabber, you've been the supplanter, you've been all about yourself, and now all of a sudden he's realizing, where he is at as they wrestle. Is that kind of a modern-day take on that?
Absolutely. All of this stuff motivates our desire to take matters into our own hands, and God says, no, all matters must be in my hands. And only in that will you as an individual succeed. Only in that will you make it through your life the way I want you to. Now, it's interesting in verse 29, Jacob asks God's name. Well, it's interesting. God's name is unknown because God's nature cannot be fully known, and there's no way that Jacob has mastery over God. Mastery doesn't apply here because Jacob knows who's stronger. He just wants to know God more. And the Lord says, don't bother. This is all you need to know for now. But it is interesting that even though Moses saw the backside of God, his back, Jacob actually sees God's face, which is why he names the place Peniel. He came face to face with God. And so the trophy from this wrestling match is the dislocated hip. The limp will be a reminder to this man, Israel, of God's work in him. This is really an interesting choice of reward because the one who used tripping to get his way now has to endure a walking disability for life because of walking God's way. And here's my point. Some of God's best people have limps. Look at Jacob's limp. Look at the Apostle Paul's thorn in the flesh. But even more so, look at the scars that remained in Jesus' side and hands and feet. When you do things God's way, we will often get wounded. But in that wounding, we learn key lessons in life, and it shapes our character. It shapes who we are so that we are better fit to do what God has for us. So let me make some applications as we kind of draw this to a close today. Abraham had to empty himself when he sacrificed or was going to sacrifice Isaac, the love of his life. Isaac had to be willing to surrender his life, and Jacob had to surrender his plans. God allowed Job to be emptied of his possessions and family before he wrestled with God. And even before Jesus came to the earth, it says in Philippians 2, he emptied himself and took on the physical form of a man in order to wrestle salvation to us. When the Lord begins doing a shaping and a maturing in us, Amazing Larry, he often brings us to a really scary situation. Then when we find ourselves emptied and helpless, much like Jacob, we're ready to roll. In other words, we're ready to rumble. The only thing we have is who we are. Then the Lord takes hold of us and begins to work us over. He slams us sometimes into the turnbuckle. He pins us to show that we're not as strong as we think we are. He wants us to get to the point of surrendering fully to him. And the worst part is that when these wrestling times happen, they can be very dark, like Jacob's night fight. We don't see our opponent clearly, nor the way through it. We just wrestle. And many people who are hearing me right now are in that wrestling, in that night fight. And all I want to say out of this verse here is, hang in there. The Lord is doing something with you. We have to come to grips with God, because in the place of emptiness and wrestling, we come face to face with who we are and what God wants from us. Sometimes it's easy. Sometimes it's really harsh. Sometimes it's encouraging. But most times we have to push against discouragement. Wrestling with God when you're on empty makes it easier to see who you really are without excuses. So let me put it this way. Thanksgiving turkeys, right? What do we say? We're going to have a feast with all the trimmings, right? Well, take away our trimmings and all we are is a cooked turkey. Or think of Christmas trees. Don't we trim a tree, right? Well, the trimmings make each tree a unique and beautiful Christmas decoration. But without those trimmings, all we are is a Charlie Brown twig. When we see ourselves for who we truly are, that can be one of the most heartbreaking and humbling things God does for us. And this usually happens when we're wrestling with him. So God comes to grips with us as well. If we're strong, if we're tenacious, holding persistently onto God in the tough time, we eventually reach our breaking point. But it's not a breaking point. It's a breakthrough point, proving that we won't give up on God, even if we're only holding on by our fingertips. We say to him like Jacob, I can't defeat this, Lord, but I won't give up on you either. And that's the level to which the Lord wants to bring each and every one of us. And this is usually when the dawn comes and the understanding grows. And the first thing we realize is this: as much as we think we're in command, the Lord can disable us at will. And that can be wonderfully freeing. So he asks us in the wrestling time, what's your name? Who are you? And our true nature surfaces. And this is really tough. It's actually a blessing from our Father. He doesn't want us to stay deceived or unaware. He doesn't want us hurting ourselves and those around us because we're clueless about who we are. It's a blessing when we finally realize, I'm not as cool as I thought I was, or as strong as I thought I was, or as godly as I thought I was. I'm a pitiful, poor, wretched, blind, naked person who sins. In other words, God looks at us and said, what's your name? And who's in control here? And our response should be, I know who I am now, Lord, and I'm not in control. Sadly, some people stay at this point wallowing in their pain, but the Father doesn't want us to stay there. So we get a name change and an adjustment. It could be small or huge. The point is, like a chiropractor, he straightens us out, realigns us, and matures us so that he can continue his new covenant plan through us. God made you the way you are, and anything that's not of him that you picked up along the way, he wants to bring it back into a line or get rid of it. The Lord didn't change Jacob into a David. He transformed Jacob into an Israel, the contender for the faith. Right?
Oh, you got it.
The Lord took what was God-given in him and made it holy. Jacob asked God his name, but God wouldn't reveal it. God may or may not reveal himself in a new way to you, Amazing Larry. We probably won't get the real reason or the full reason why the Lord threw us down and started wrestling us, especially when we hear a noise behind us and God comes off the turnbuckle and slams us to the mat, right? We get all twisted and fretting, oh, why is God doing this? Why is he trying to teach me about himself? And God says, you don't need to know. And at that point, we just surrender. God will explain it eventually, but we're on a need-to-know basis. And at this point in life, we may never need to know.
Right.
On the other side of dawn, we realize we've survived again. And the worst part of wrestling with God in a harsh, painful place is that we think we're going to die. We think we're going to die from the ugly things we see in ourselves, from the blinding truth of seeing what God intended us to be, from the knowledge of how we failed God, from the breaking of our hearts when we realize that God forgives us, and from the overwhelming gratitude that it all comes from Him and nothing from us. And the beautiful thing is we know when we come out in the dawn that we've seen God's face in the struggle. And you will have your own limp. Not all limps are bad. It's our limitations. And as the movie character Clint Eastwood says, a man's got to know his limitations. Limps make us rely on stronger things like God. Limps keep us from running ahead of God. And we all pick up our share of limps as we mature with Him. And remember, some of God's best people have limps. What do you think of that?
Well, I do, and I like the Clint Eastwood quote. I remember, "Make my day," and I don't know if we say that to God or not, but the psalmist kind of did when he said, "Search my heart and see if there's anything unrighteous or uncharacteristic of you in me." So, Dr. J, we've got to bring it all to a conclusion today. So, until next week, what do you say?
Do a little self-examination. Look and appreciate at the limps that you've acquired in life through the things that God has brought you through. Remember, God doesn't want to destroy us. He wants to bless us. He wants to develop us. And that's why He does what He does. Remember, God loves you. He has not abandoned you. And even if it's in the darkness of night and you're wrestling with things right now, remember that God is there with you, and you're going to come out of this a changed person.
The Truth Barista is a listener-supported ministry that depends on the gifts of listeners like you. Please consider a gift to this Christ-honoring ministry today. Please include the station call letters, or if you're listening online, go to highbeamministry.com. That is highbeamministry.com. While you're on the website, check out all the ministry resources that are available. The blog, the Cruisin' Through the Bible commentary series, online classes, and don't forget to subscribe. We want to keep you informed about all the new series that we create for radio and the podcasts. Remember, we like feedback, so send us an email at highbeamministry.com. The Truth Barista, teaching God's Word as truth for faith and practice. Join us again next week for a cup of God's truth on The Truth Barista.
Do you want the truth today? Dr. Jay Christensen is the Truth Barista and the founder of High Beam Ministry. Jay is a creative person who wants to use the setting of an imaginary cafe to produce a series of radio and internet programs that confront the issues of our day through the lens of the Bible. The Truth Barista was the avenue that was developed to communicate truth using the Bible as the source of our information. The Truth Barista is a production of High Beam Ministry and can be found online at highbeamministry.com.